I think culturally, at least in the United States, a lot of diversity conversations really centered around race. And I think in aquatics, a lot of the conversation is more centered around overall accessibility into the facility or into the programs that we offer. And so we see things kind of catching some momentum as far as, new facilities thinking about accessibility, but also full ramps to get into lap lanes and different things along those lines. And then we obviously have had a lot of momentum towards sensory programs and things designed for people who are neurodivergent, which is really awesome. But I think that in our space, we want to be thinking about all of the things. So, not just about adaptive programs, not just about maybe multilingual resources, but kind of the overarching categories of things, and then being super mindful of how our community is unique.
Welcome to AOAP's Discussion from the Deep End, a podcast for aquatic professionals by aquatic professionals. We're here to share real stories and practical ideas to help you run safer and stronger aquatic programs and facilities. I'm Daniel Peters, your host, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Kirsten Barnes. AOAP is a nonprofit dedicated to improving aquatic education, recreation, and safety through training, resources, and community. Today's conversation is all about DEIJ in aquatics, not just as an idea, but as something practical, actionable, and woven into the way we work. We'll talk about how inclusion shows up in day-to-day operations, why it is important for the profession, and how aquatic leaders can build spaces where people feel welcome and supported.
Today, we're excited to welcome Kate Connell, Diversity Liaison for AOAP Board of Directors. Kate's day job is the Senior Manager of Sales and Partnerships at AOAPs. She also brings her work focusing on the art of connecting who we are to what we do through interactive workshops and education sessions throughout her business, Equitable Aquatics. She also has served on the AOAP Board of Directors since 2024, chairs the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Committee, and co-chairs the 2027 Conference Education Committee, all while serving in a volunteer capacity as the Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications for International Lifeguard Critical Incident Response Alliance. Kate brings a thoughtful, grounded perspective on how DEIJ connects to association leadership, conference planning, and the everyday work of making aquatics more inclusive. She's also been recognized by Aquatics International for her work in this area, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about how she turns those values into actions.
Thanks for having me.
Kate, when people hear DEIJ in aquatics, they may think of it as the big picture concept. How do you define it in a way that feels practical and useful for facility leaders, operators, and vendors?
Yeah, so this is a great question to start with. And I will just demystify what DEIJ is and what we're talking about. So it stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And there is some common agreement on what these terms mean, kind of from the more academic sphere. But when we're talking about it as it applies to the work that we do in aquatics, and obviously as it relates to the association, we're trying to move away from more of the idea behind just having like a mission statement or having kind of these best intentions, and instead move into having practical systems and behaviors that really show up for the people that you employ. So that can look like making sure that your team is diverse in their identity and in their perspectives, but also feeling safe to be able to be themselves and bring them their full selves to work, as well as the operational decisions that you are making on a daily basis, and connecting that back to how you're making sure that barriers to participate in your programs and the folks that come to your facility are feeling welcomed and respected. So that introduction talked a lot about the practicality piece. And I think that I like to really turn these concepts into measurable behaviors, but also into conversations around our best practices as it relates to policy and things like that.
So, Kate, you really talked about taking it further than just writing it down in your mission statement. Can you give us a couple of examples of how you're seeing DEIJ in action in aquatics programs or with teams that are working?
Yeah. So, and I think this will look a little bit different for everybody. I always like to remind people that everyone's coming to the table with different tools and different kind of starting points. So some people already are working as part of an agency that has taken these concepts really seriously, and in the last, 6, 5, 4 years have really made that part of their identity. And so they have a lot more kind of buy-in from their leadership, but then also there's kind of this mandate that part of our values as a city or as a nonprofit or as a for-profit business is centered around these ideas of inclusion. With that in mind, there's going to be a big perspective of what's available and accessible for different actions and different policies. But I do think it fits into a couple of different categories. So there's the staffing side, making sure that your staff feel psychologically safe at work, and making sure then that when people are coming to you with concepts and ideas that probably feel really sticky and difficult to deal with, even for the most seasoned aquatic director or the most kind of read up person who cares a lot about social justice and cares a lot about inclusion, still might make you kind of nervous and have to move through it for the first time and just be hung up on being worried that you might be able to process it with them appropriately. But making sure that when those items do come to you, that you do your best to learn them, and then you bring in additional resources as well, and that the communication piece is a big part of that. Obviously, making sure that there's representation in leadership and all the different layers of how you're approaching things is also really important from the staffing level. But I think making sure that when stuff comes up, we're addressing it and we're being aware of it and we're being mindful of it is that kind of first few steps. There's also things to think about when it comes to your guests. So, what are you doing to make sure that people feel supported and like they're able to come to your facility? And some of the other stuff, like some of that invisible baggage or that invisible backpack you sometimes hear in DEIJ spaces where you come into a room and you show up as you are, but all of this other stuff comes with you, your experiences, parts of your identity, your lived life, essentially, all of the things that are you and have been a part of your makeup and your history kind of show up with you as well. How do you be mindful of that and make sure that even if someone might not be the most typical attendee at your water park or at your beach run or at your pool or in your program, how can you make sure that they feel welcomed and respected, and making sure that your team has some of those soft skills in their backpack, their invisible backpack, to be able to make sure that if they encounter situations that are a little bit sensitive or a little bit kind of polarized in some way, that they're able to work through it, even if they don't have the exact solution or the exact answer, or you haven't explicitly trained on what to do if A, B, and C, they still have some of those abilities to work through that. And then lastly, just making sure that policies are being built in real time. So yes, absolutely start by looking at the policies that you have and ask that really thoughtful question of yourself and of your other team members, including your part-time staff. Are these policies as inclusive as they could be? What might we be intentionally dissuading people to participate, or where might we unintentionally keeping staff from being able to feel like they fully belong and are part of this culture? And then as you go, as we all do, continue to make improvements to those things. So as those things come up, especially in the summer, in your busy season, write it down, take notes, see what questions others are asking, notice what things are becoming sensationalized. AOAP always has lots of great links to different stories and things that we can see online that sometimes include some of these things, like people trying to do something and maybe missing the mark and learning from it, or maybe they're doing something and it's a grand success, but learn from that, make an ongoing list, and then make sure that just like with every other thing that you do, you go back and you revise and you take a look and you continue to improve and kind of push forward towards those areas.
You touched on kind of the everyday operations and kind of that backside with the guests that we don't really talk about or hear about all the time. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for aquatic professionals to make DEIJ part of the everyday operations?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think culturally, at least in the United States, a lot of diversity conversations really centered around race. And I think in aquatics, a lot of the conversation is more centered around overall accessibility into the facility or into the programs that we offer. And so we see things kind of catching some momentum as far as, new facilities thinking about accessibility, not just chair lifts, but also, full ramps to get into lap lanes and different things along those lines. And then we obviously have had a lot of momentum towards sensory programs and things designed for people who are neurodivergent, which is really awesome. But I think that in our space, we want to be thinking about all of the things. So, not just about adaptive programs, not just about maybe multilingual resources, but kind of the overarching categories of things, and then being super mindful of how our community is unique. So, an example of that, Daniela, is if you live somewhere in the southern part of the country and there's a lot of population there, you may organically already have a lot of multilingual resources and a lot of diversity on your team because of that. And you might already run some programs that are multilingual. So that probably isn't the best place to start because it's already, maybe you're a few steps already ahead. But I definitely think the very first thing we can do is ask the question of what's available in our community as far as community resources and partnerships, and try to tap into some of that. So part of my volunteer time in my personal life is I'm on a county board for folks that are helping at-risk youth. And one of the biggest things that we're always talking about is redundancy of intention, and how do we make sure that everyone's aware and socialized to the idea that these things exist. So I think as a professional, wherever you are, I think the first thing to do is to really figure out what's going on in the community around you and how are those different agencies serving different types of people and different identities in your community. And then from there, you're going to learn a lot about what exists and what there's a lot of volume of, and that's going to tell you a lot about your community. And then you can start to kind of work backwards, and be able to look at things like adaptive programming would be the next best thing for us to start with. Or maybe we need to think about hiring and onboarding, or maybe we need to be thinking about, staff training, because we are already seeing a lot of groups come to our facility that maybe are helping different ages and stages of disabled adults or disabled children. So I think the first thing to do is to know thyself a little bit, to walk backwards a little bit, be curious about your area and kind of where you're serving. And then from there, I think you can start to be really intentional about what things you pick to focus on. The ideal answer is we want you to do all the stuff, but that's just not realistic. Everyone's going to have their own ability to start kind of where they're personally interested as well. And I think that's okay to focus on too. Like if your expertise is swim lessons, then think to yourself, like, how can I lean into this and how can I bring this concept into swim lessons? If you focus more on the staff training, then focus on that. If you are in charge more of policy, then kind of think about some of that stuff. But it's definitely an ongoing thing that we're all thinking about. And I think you want to really bring together what does the community need and what already exists? What are you exceptional at and what do you like to do? And then that last part is also thinking about what tools and resources you have, and know that that's different. Some people have really fat budgets and everyone's super jealous. Some people, they're overstaffed. They have so much people power, and that's also really awesome. Some people have progressive workplaces and they already have a ton of resources laid out, and they have someone who's just specifically in charge of community engagement. And so that's a resource too. So it's kind of that trifecta. Thinking of all three of those pieces, I think, will help you figure out what your personal biggest opportunity is at your agency. And then you can start building some plans based on that.
Kate, you talked about this idea of starting with awareness and then taking action. But I know we hear a lot of people say some of the time that it feels like the guide rails are moving on us sometimes as the industry is changing and we learn more about different pieces of DEIJ. What's a good way that professionals can manage that, or a good resource that they can kind of use as a benchmark?
That's a great question. And I wish we had one really robust resource. I think you're completely correct that it's always evolving and it's always changing. And unfortunately, I think that pressure sometimes make it so that we don't take any action because we're worried about doing the wrong thing, and then kind of unintentionally, maybe kind of leaning into this like cancel culture, and it really blowing up that we're trying to do something right and we really kind of screw it up along the way. And that's a lot of pressure, because all of us are experts in aquatics, but that other piece of needing or wanting to understand, and we haven't even talked about the different layers of inclusion, but it's endless, right? There's endless concepts and there's endless ideas and vocabulary and all this type of stuff. So I think it's very real to be in a place of paralysis where you're worried about what to do and kind of to go forward and do the right thing, and know what that is. And I think the resource I'd point people to is back, obviously, to the AOAP website. The DEIJ committee has worked to put a lot of different resources on the webpage that is devoted to our committee. And we've done a lot of work to try to get kind of the loudest topics out first as far as webinars are concerned, and trying to get those topics represented as well at conference, and then building out different articles and blog posts that hopefully are what's on people's mind. And I do think it's a mix of that really practical, actionable, do this, then do this approach. But then it's also kind of some of these bigger concepts. And risk management, it's a lot like that too. We kind of talk circularly around risk management, and then we try to break it down into here's how you do audits, here's how you use zones of coverage and things like that. So same type of idea. What I would say though on a personal level is be curious, try to lean into those soft skills that we're always trying to build out with our team. So curiosity, active listening, trying to really hear what people are asking for. And then also kind of work through the art of messing things up. And when you say the wrong thing, a lot of it's based around long language and our intention. So doing some of that, I think, is also super helpful when it comes to trying to just start somewhere. But I definitely would point us back to the DEIJ work that our committee's been doing and some of the resources on that page. And obviously it's never ending work. So as more things come up, we're doing our best to kind of hear from people in the industry. And we try to do a survey every year of aquatic professionals as well, just to get a pulse of what's coming up for them and what they're seeing in their actual communities and through engagements with staff and with the public as well. And then using that to create more thought leadership and more education and things along those lines.
You talked about a little bit some of the topics and traits on what people can do to make it actionable, but how do you kind of help move from that awareness piece to that actionable piece?
Yes. So I think we're already really well suited in aquatics to practice, and we're already well suited to have this container of training that we use to inform people towards the best practices, if you will. A lot of the training that we do is super technical, and we're using things like scenarios, practice, and repetition. And we already have this normalization around ongoing learning and ongoing feedback. So as much as we can, building things that are already in the structure that you have is going to be a really accessible way to start to work through some of these concepts with your team, and giving them examples of situations they might encounter, or giving them some different scripts, or pulling from your own experiences as you've been at your agency or prior agencies, or even the situations that we like are on the phone with one of our aquatics besties and we're like, I cannot believe that just happened. Where you hear kind of through the chain that these different things have happened, really using those as an opportunity to work through and build conversation around topics, and kind of not shying away from some of that stuff. Giving your staff opportunity to practice helps build that muscle, and it obviously can also help with accountability. If everyone on the team is learning these things together, then that also builds out expectation around treating people with dignity and respect, and what you expect from each other and what you expect for their behavior towards people visiting your facility. And then it also can help with some of the behavioral change, right? So when you've been in aquatics long enough, you know a huge part of what we're doing is trying to get people to buy into behavioral consistency that is centered around risk management. So when it comes to these topics, the same rules apply essentially. You definitely can and should do DEIJ trainings that really go from icebreakers to different training topics and role playing, and kind of building on different layers there, and even working with your team to create goals and benchmarks for what accessibility looks like in your agency. But to start, it's really just layering some of those topics into what's already existing. I'm only a couple years out from being a practitioner myself as an aquatics professional. So I understand that you have limitations around your own energy, your own ability to create curriculum, your own amount of hours that you already are able to have your staff train, and the follow through of that. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, days and days and days of training. It doesn't have to be, bringing in an expert like me, although that absolutely could be an option, but it also can be bite-sized. And I think we need to not dismiss even the smallest kind of movement that we go from awareness to that action. And we need to reward ourselves when we're able to do kind of some of those tiny little crumbs until we're able to kind of build more and more from there. You'd be really surprised, I think, at some of the just like the small ways we could implement different topics in that really can move the needle for your internal team of feeling like, oh, okay, we're talking about this. I align with that. I feel heard and seen, and it gives them that kind of recognition. But then also, it gives them a little bit of tools that often all of these things are really translatable to other areas in our field too. So active listening is going to help with DEIJ topics. It's going to help when you have a teenager or a young adult kind of muddle through this really sensitive situation of someone breastfeeding on the deck, maybe. But it's also going to help with tons of other stuff too. And it's also going to help them just be a more well rounded human and a more curious, thoughtful, hopefully empathetic person too.
I love that, taking it down to kind of those baseline things. You've touched on this a little bit in the work that the AOAP DEIJ Committee is doing. You are our diversity liaison. So tell us a little bit about what responsibilities come with that role, and what do you feel success looks like for you in that role?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think there's a few different channels that we're looking to like have some influence over. Obviously, having some collective but diverse voices around some different topics and highlighting people in the field who are maybe paving the way a little bit with special events that have to do with this topic, or approaches with swimming lessons, or training concepts that are really like kind of cutting edge is a big part of it. So just stripping things down to some basics and trying to get that socialization around some best practices and creating content that aligns with that has been really important. I often get excited about topics that are kind of like a 2.0 or a 3.0 or a 4.0. And I have to remind myself that we're all entering from different starting points. And I think this is true with aquatics in general, right? I regularly tell people it took me a few years into my full-time work to even like have enough courage to try to understand what people were talking about when they talked about audits, because I felt like I already had to have known it. And so I was nervous to kind of admit that I didn't. And I think there's a lot of topics like that actually in aquatics. And I think there's definitely many in the DEIJ conversation. So stripping some of that back. And then also, a lot of us on this committee are super, super personally invested in DEIJ work, either because that's the work that we do or because of our own lived experiences. So it can be really easy to get kind of caught up in these like really big shiny things, and sometimes success is actually looking like just the basic kind of low-hanging fruit version of these things. And then for others, it is still adding in some of those shiny things. Then the last channel I would say is just being really mindful when we're having conversations about strategic planning and alignment and things along those lines, and just thinking about some practical ways that the association can be thinking about making sure that we're having conversations like this. We're building, a culture at AOAP through the conference and through the education, through this podcast, of making sure that we're thinking about this and that operationally we can have a positive impact through the different decisions that we make. I think a lot of times the conversation in aquatics is how unsupported we are and how siloed we are and how kind of off in our own lane we are. And I think that's valid for a lot of people and true. But I think the other side of that is, because that is often the case, we also have so much potential to be able to like really kind of own what we're doing and make sure that the policies that we have in place, the way that we're working with our staff, and the way that we are running programs is as baked as possible with all of these concepts in it, because we don't have a ton of oversight usually in the organization. But as a collective, we have a lot of power to be able to really ask ourselves, how are we doing this? How are we adding these things in? So that's the other lane, just trying to give different ideas to the industry and having some conversation with other board members and AOAP staff about some of the different things we've seen in the industry. And I will say we're really lucky at the association level, because I don't think that the DEIJ committee was ever put together in this like reactive way that was more performative. I think it was really intentionally done. And I think that staff at the association personally cares a lot about this topic. And that's not always the case. So we're lucky in that sense that we're kind of like that agency where the city manager or the city council cares a lot about this. So we're lucky in that way that we're able to do a lot of the stuff that we'd like to do. And staff's been super receptive to it. And also other people on the board and other staff come with ideas as well, which is really exciting. And it's felt very collaborative, which is obviously already one of the major marks of success for any committee to have.
What have you learned about how AOAP can best support more inclusive practices across the profession?
Yeah. So one of the things we've been having some conversation about is representation among the board and what that looks like and how we think about representation, not just personal identity, but obviously professional identity too, and just making sure that we're representing aquatic professionals. I think a lot of us have that municipal experience, myself included, all of us on this call included. And so a lot of times, the examples that I give are really in line with my experience in the municipal world, but trying to find some ways to make sure that we're talking to all different types of professionals from all different types of organizations has been really important. The DEIJ committee has gotten more and more diverse as far as the folks identity wise, but also with what types of organizations they work with. So we have someone that works at a Jewish community center. We have a Boys and Girls Club, two folks from the nonprofit space, the YMCA, the military. So thinking about that with the board as well, I think is really important. That representation is a huge piece. I also think that mentoring and kind of giving more space to up and coming professionals, whether they're newer to the field or just newer to the professional world, is really important. So we've been thinking a lot about that too. And the board has been working on lots of different ways to kind of activate that. Our current board president, Joey, has been instrumental in some of the mentorship capacity, which I think is really exciting. I also think the other inclusive practices, I mean, in general, we just want to be thinking about community building and being steady and consistent with the things that we're trying to do. So sometimes we're able to do a lot of things all at once, and that's great. And we can kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. But it's also that momentum of time. And it does take time. It does take effort and energy to build community. And I think that's the huge kind of why behind AOAP and the ethos. It started from building community, and it was people that came together to build community, and more of that is trying to lean into as community kind of evolves and we have other folks coming into the industry, just making sure that everyone feels like there's a place for their voice and that people raise their hand to speak for the first time at conference or want to be a part of different projects and things. They want to volunteer and they want to do different things, that we're really fostering that and making sure that there's a seat at the table essentially for everybody who wants to be a part of it.
I think that's something that having DEIJ committee representation on the conference education committee specifically has really been an important piece of us rounding out education in that way. You talked a little bit about it earlier, about it's more than just a mission statement, but we still want to keep this idea of inclusion as a center of our discussions about mission, events, ideas. How do you keep that anchor in place when there are so many competing priorities?
Yes, I think a lot of people kind of see themselves either as like more of the people aquatics person or more of like the risk management drowning prevention side. I've always been interested in aquatics because I love people and I love leadership and training and things along those lines. And so aquatics happened to be the vessel for me, but the real why was always that connection with people and making sure that the decisions that I made were people centric. The training that we did was people centric. The development, the leadership, the professional focus was all based around being really people centered and people first. And so I think not to say that inclusion isn't a part of operational excellence and risk management, because it absolutely is. But I would say wherever you are in either of those sides, I think that's the frame of mind you come at this as. So if you're on more on the people side, then I think you need to be focusing around, people-centered decisions essentially, and thinking about, who's being included, who might be unintentionally excluded. How can I be curious? How can I ask questions? How can I get more people involved? Hear what they have to say, take feedback as impersonally as possible, which I know is challenging. I joke all the time that I ask for feedback and then I'm like really like, okay, like I really have to like coach myself through it. So if you're on that side, be all there. If you're on more of that risk management, operations, drowning prevention side, then I think for you, like really be focusing on processes and that operational excellence and be thinking about, the values that your organization has and what it's boiling down to, and knowing that making sure that everyone feels welcome and safe is a strategy towards prevention, towards incidents, whether that's harassment, whether that's injury or drowning, whether that's opportunity for people to be upset with customer service and your policy and things like that. So I think depending on where you are, I think it can fit really well and anchor to both of those priorities. If you're someone who feels like you really love both of those things, then even more of a reason. Both of them kind of really at their core are about inclusion, essentially. That's what's really neat about DEIJ topics anyway, is it's its own thing, but it's also layers into every single thing that we do. And I think one of my brain superpowers is kind of like spinning everything into something that's related to equity or inclusion. And I think if you can think of it through that lens all the time, then that lets you kind of go further into those questions. I just had a conversation with a friend yesterday. We were at an event at my son's school and we were talking about like some relationship stuff and how she was asking her partner questions, and she was like, "Well, why not? Well, why not?" And like kind of like five times through, right? And each layer you kind of peel back another layer, another layer. I think this is like that too. I think ultimately you'll get to the heart of accessibility and inclusion and justice and all of these things. I think you just need to keep asking. So you keep asking, thinking about all of the different questions. Is this sustainable? Is this accessible? Does anybody have any barriers to participate? Who's missing from the conversation? Like you keep going, 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 going. And I think that can really help us anchor as well.
Then, as like the field expert in DEIJ, what are some of the questions that you ask the board or the committee to make sure that AOAP is being intentional and not just being symbolic?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I will say that I think I have some more work probably to be doing some of this as well and asking those questions. But I think, we have a lot of conversations around things. And so having the voice of being able to step up and ask those questions of, how are we measuring this, or what are we doing tangibly, stepwise after this to continue this conversation. And then asking questions too, like who overall is benefiting from us doing this in this way or adding this concept to programming for the conference or to the strategic plan. And then just talking through different things and holding space too. I think for other people that want to maybe speak up but are still navigating their own voice in some of this work, and they might have questions about if it's accessible and is it sustainable and who's missing from the conversation and things like that. So sitting in that seat and kind of being the one who is willing to hold the space for it, ask the questions, have some of the follow up is important, and definitely something to go back to, measuring our success that I use. And and again, all of this is always evolving and changing. So always going back to it too and asking some questions around that. Just saying, this was what we were thinking when we made this decision. This was the approach that we took. Is it doing what we intended for it to do, or could it unintentionally be impacting the industry or individuals in a certain way that we hadn't been mindful of? I think one of the best skills that a lot of people are missing is learning new information and adjusting your thought process around it. I regularly try to consume things of opposite ideas of myself because I'm trying to understand how that could be true or why that might be a reality for someone else, right? Because I know that as strongly as I feel about certain things, people feel the exact opposite. So trying to understand that I think is really important. And then I think that the act of messing things up and taking accountability and changing your mind when new information is introduced, and just trying to, I think we see in meetings and in work situations or volunteer situations all the time. Like people just kind of keep doubling down on the same idea instead of kind of pulling back and just being like, well, what would happen if we just looked at this from a different angle or a different lens? Sometimes that's takes a person to ask that question. Sometimes that's more of an internal work process we can do. But I think either way, I think pausing and trying to do that can be super beneficial, whether it's committee work, board work, or at your organization when you're kind of moving through the process of things.
And that's really important to be able to take that step back and go back to why did we do this? What was the intention? Does it still apply? So, kind of speaking more broadly about AOAP, Kate, how do you encourage more aquatic professionals to see themselves as part of the AOAP community?
This is a fun question too, because I think it's one of those things that everyone feels like, well, of course, everyone, everyone is invited and welcome. But some people need that actual invitation. So as much as possible, I really try to ask myself, who am I pulling into this space? Not because I'm like forcing them in, but who am I actively trying to provide opportunity for them to step into their own voice or into creating content, whether that's part of the committee work or just jumping into a committee. I think a lot of people want to be of value, but oftentimes they feel like they're not exactly sure what to do, or it feels like there's already a lot of voices. And so sometimes those people are the most important people to try to engage and encourage that relationship with and some mentorship with. Um, what's difficult about that is sometimes the people that are already involved are the ones that are just like, okay, I'll just get this done. And they don't want to let people down. So they're the ones to kind of do it. But I think creating some space for other people to fill in with their expertise is really key. I also think that meeting people where they are is important. So finding different ways to engage people has been important. I always try to ask as part of our committee, what are some of the goals that you have? What are some of the interests that you have? And like, where do you, like you asked in the beginning, what does success look like for you as it's related to your engagement in the committee? Because I don't just want anybody to just attend every meeting, but not really kind of contribute to the conversation or to the workload. Not because not because it can't be done by one or two people. I mean, that sometimes is the way that it is, just without pushing that boundary to try to get more people involved. But I also want it to be something where they too have the ability to create momentum in their area to get more people involved and in kind of approach them with different ideas for networking or engagement or encouraging kind of that mentorship as well. And the more we do that, the more people are satisfied with their volunteerism and their engagement with the association, and then that's the ripple effect that kind of continues to go out, and then the voices become more and more diverse, and that's awesome. We want those perspectives, and we want to make sure that that's happening. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. I really want people to take some ownership over it, and this probably feels really parallel for a lot of aquatic professionals because I think a lot of us do that when we're mentoring staff or managing staff, as we try to think, what's next for you? What do you want to be doing? How do we fill in the gaps on some of this stuff so that way you feel like you have some experience? And then also just trying to also activate lots of different personality types. So some people don't want to stand up in front of a room of 50 people at a conference and present, but they might have some other ways that they can contribute to the conversation, and we want to make sure there's something for everyone essentially. So also thinking about ways that we can be engaging that might not be the ways that I like to engage. Like when the committee first started, it was really centered around bringing in diverse speakers and topics. And that was because that's like my zone of genius, right? But we want to really expand that and think about other ways we can activate different professionals and get their engagement as well. And so year over year, it's expanded and it's changed, and people have brought their own spin to things, which I think is really important.
Yeah, have you talked about the importance of moving DEIJ from policy to into practice? What does that transition look like in real life?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different components on the staffing side. Making sure that you're working through training processes and that you're reinforcing concepts through training is important. This will help with some of the behavioral change. If you have some things happening behaviorally that aren't maybe in alignment with as inclusive of practices as possible, like you're seeing things like there being different interactions between staff, or you're seeing some dismissal of these different topics and ideas, then that definitely can help towards behavioral change. Making sure that you're consistent and that there's accountability is important too. So consistency as it relates to communication, as it relates to day-to-day interactions, but then also there being, when it's appropriate, accountability and response to things not being done in a way that is as respectful or as inclusive as possible, and making sure that there's follow through there. So just like there would be for other employee type interactions, we all know that if we don't address things when when they pop up, then they can really turn into some bigger issues. So just like you would dance through some of that stuff, you also need to do that when it comes to these topics. And then maybe the most important thing is making sure that you're really modeling this as a leader. There's obviously going to be instances where you can model this very publicly, very obviously, and kind of do some of these things that's going to make it clear that you care about these topics, like um, speaking about it and having trainings about it and having, pronouns in your email signature. Like there are some things that are in that category that feel kind of outwardly facing, like I'm taking a stand for inclusion and diversity and things like that. But then there's all this stuff kind of under the iceberg too, that iceberg analogy we always see, like the stuff above the water. There's a little bit above the water for sure, but then the rest of the stuff is all under the water, and you have to be willing to have difficult conversations and be willing to really focus on accountability, being willing to focus on that operational consistency of asking the question of, is this in alignment with what some of these goals are? And so I think that's a big piece of it. A lot of this is really thoughtful leadership, but then it's also the tasks and the behaviors that are aligned with this too. And just asking questions of, can we put this into training? Can we write this policy down? Can we include this in our hiring practices? Can I, as the leader here, take a little training on hiring bias? And can I educate myself on some of these things that might come up, not as a way to kind of demonize myself or the process or like the wider culture that I've been a part of because I'm doing something wrong, but because I can create some space to improve and do things better, and then turn that into some action items and some steps that you can take that you can then check off and feel like you're doing some of these things. And again, they're going to be hidden, less bells and whistles potentially. You're not going to get probably a lot of kudos coming your way because people won't really notice that you're doing some of that stuff. But that really is the stuff that can make a huge difference between that policy and the practice piece.
You talked a little bit about kind of taking those policies to practice, what that looks like. But if I'm just getting started on this and I want to be more inclusive, is there a behavior or a system that I should look at first that could help give me some guidance?
Yes, I don't think there's a wrong first step, but I do think a really practical first step is your hiring and your onboarding, because it is something that is relatively universal across the industry that we can take a look at, and we can do a few things within that lane. We can look at ourselves as the mechanism that's hiring, and we can start to ask some questions of ourselves. And this is a space where even if you have a lot of guide rails that you need to stay in from HR and from process and how you are supposed to do things, you still have the ability to let your personhood and your empathy come through this process. And I think that's a really good place to start. I already mentioned, some bias that we can have when it comes to hiring, but even just going through the entire process of asking questions around, what's going to be a mindful process for someone who has never had a job before. What's a process improvement I can make for someone who's neurodivergent, where the way that they present in an interview might be really inconsistent from how they might react most of the other time. How can I be mindful of how these questions are written so that someone who is learning English or English isn't their primary language used at home can read these and understand what we're asking without having kind of like extra buzzwords and jargon in there, or overly complicated questions, or even just questions that are a little bit outside the box where you're just like kind of measuring. I'm a hater of fun interview questions, and I feel a little bad even saying that. Like, what color crayon would you be? It's like, is that something that, if it's for fun, can you go backwards and ask, what's the intent of this question? And is it possible that this might really trip somebody up in this process, and someone might not answer this how I deem typical, and then this has like derailed the entire thing. So I think hiring systems, onboarding, even advertising for jobs, and then those first few kind of steps they take as a new employee can be really eye-opening for people, and it also can let you kind of move through the motions of a lens of asking those questions. How is this experience for someone who is neurodivergent? How is this experience for someone who was not coached at home about how to have these conversations in this setting, who wasn't told by an adult, like, shake their hand, look them in the eye, send them a thank you email? So how do we start to also like dismantle some of these like professionalism ideas and just understanding that not everybody is coming necessarily with that same coaching either? I know that we spend a lot of energy collectively kind of talking about kids these days, and I think there's some things there that we can be mindful of why it might look different. And I think this is a really good place to start. It's also kind of an isolated place to start for a lot of us with the actual interview process, but then it's also a place where we likely already have a little bit of support. So we already maybe have access to some resources like hiring bias or interview bias videos that we have to watch, or we already have some best practices from our HR office and things like that. So I think this is a really good place to start if you are just getting started, and a great place to examine your systems overall as well.
And can I say for people who are listening, thinking about their interview process, I have sat in on dozens of Kate's presentations. We have had many, many conversations about this, but I will tell you that the way you challenged me the most through DEI is talking about the questions that I always thought were the best way to ask interview questions. And when you made me stop and think about some of those things you just talked about, I really realized that I might be doing a disservice to candidates. So this is just to the people who are listening that are thinking, well, that's a little scary. Like, I get it. And also, when you take the step back, like Kate talked about earlier, it is a learning opportunity for us. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I love that. I think it's a good area too. That's a good representation of like the traditional, I'm using air quotes if you can't see us, but like the traditional aquatics professional is derivative of the recreation professional, which is also derivative of like the camp counselor vibe of like, yay, we're all excited. And like, I think a lot of times that extroversion is kind of normalized, but there's a lot of different personality types. And that is also a way that we encounter inclusion, right? We have different people and we need all types on the team. So I think often the normal mode is like us, Kirsten, where it's very extroverted and very like, if you could be any shape, what shape would you be and why? And like it comes from that excited place. So it's not to just cancel out that excitement. It's also to be aware if you are going to ask questions like that, then you also have to be objective enough when you get an answer that is not the way that you would answer that question, that doesn't make or break the process or like give you a bad feeling or you don't read into it too much, right? It's also being self-aware enough to know that that will land with certain people and it won't with others. And you have to be less binary about your reaction to their reaction, essentially, which I think is also really important.
With that, what's one way that you think you can measure whether the effort is actually making a difference?
That's a great question. I think that, there is an answer here that would be along the lines of, you're getting that feedback and your team looks more diverse and you feel personally like it's made a difference. But I think sometimes the hardest part about this work is that we don't necessarily know. Sometimes people are going to come up to you and say, hey, I just want to let you know this is my kid's first job when you hired them a couple summers ago, and you really set the tone for how they should be interacting with a supervisor and a belonging, focused workplace. And I'm super grateful for that chance that you gave my kid. But a lot of times that's not going to be the case. In fact, I think the more you focus on DEIJ topics, sometimes the more feedback you get that tells you that you're not making the mark. And that can be really difficult sometimes because you feel like the more you're doing, the more feedback you're getting because people of all types are coming and they all have very different opinions. And I even found this to be true in my municipal work is that the more that we did, the more complaints we would get about certain stuff. I also think this is even true about like auditing and doing mystery shopping and all that type of stuff, is it gets kind of more ugly before it gets better. And sometimes you don't really know that you are doing a better job in certain areas because more things are coming up, right? When you start to have training with your staff and you say, come to us when someone's saying something off color or racist or sexist or inappropriate in the staff room. And then all of a sudden, because you said that, you have 75 complaints and you're like, oh my, like since I brought this up, all of a sudden we have all these inappropriate conversations. And once you start holding staff accountable to it, you also have to follow through with some of it. And then you realize more people are complaining, and they're complaining because you've given them an opportunity to bring forth something. And then you've also done something about it, right? We've all complained or shared, I should say, complain kind of has this negative connotation. We've all disclosed information and then felt like we put ourselves out there and nothing happened with that information that we trusted someone else to make a decision with or to help us with. So when you start to actually support your staff and help and kind of go through these processes, other people that maybe weren't ready yet to jump in will also start to potentially disclose different information. That's not going to feel like success. That's going to feel freaking terrible. You're going to be like, wow, no one here knows how to act. And so I think we need to be careful not to get too hung up in some of the metrics around like, again, what success looks like, that are, some of them can be measurable, but some of it's going to be anecdotal, unfortunately. Some of it's going to be really hard to measure. Some of it's going to have to be kind of more of measuring on a vibe of like, are we kind of moving in that direction? Obviously, when it comes to offering accessible programs and adaptive sim lessons and having policies that are as inclusive as possible and hiring practices, you can measure all of that stuff, and you can have the best policies and you can have inclusive events that no one shows up to. So it's this is not a very clean answer, but I think it's all of the pieces. I think you do have some measurement metrics put in there. I think you do measure what you can measure. And then I also think you also need to take a pulse from your team and also ask them for some candid feedback and some anonymous feedback. And then also be super self-aware, which that's probably the tagline of this podcast episode is self-awareness also is really important. And it's an underdeveloped muscle for a lot of us. So are you able to really give that lens of what you're doing and kind of take yourself out of it too, and have other people that are trusted voices come in and give you some of that feedback as well?
So, Kate, you talked a lot about kind of starting with the hiring process. We've talked about that there's a lot of conversation around inclusive programming. Do you think that there's something that's regularly overlooked when organizations try to become more inclusive?
One of the things that I think would be the best and a resource you already have and that you are already paying for would be to get some feedback back from your staff. Generally speaking, there is such a wealth of information anyway, and a lot of our staff are with us for a limited time, but they also have a different lens than we do as people who have maybe done this for year after year and we're doing it full time and we're looking at it over and over again. So I think an area that we can spend some more time focusing on is our staff and getting some input from them. And this can feel a little bit scary and it can kind of open up a little bit of a Pandora's box, as they say. But I think asking your staff for some feedback and giving them opportunity to do a few different feedback opportunities, some that are anonymous and some that aren't, is really good. I also think that this can also track back to some measurements. So you can be looking at things like, does your staff feel safe at work? Are you seeing retention year over year? And what do you think is driving that? So sometimes retention is going to be time and place, right? There's you already have a benefit of they already know it for the second and third summer. But you can also ask them questions around retention. Like if you didn't come back and money was not an object, what would keep you? Would it be you have other interests? Would it be that we're not following up on some of the things that we say we're going to? I think leaning into that with your staff and asking them lots of questions can be hugely helpful. I also think that you have people on your team that absolutely know more about certain topics that are DEIJ focused than you do because of their own interests and their own identity. And so it's not appropriate to always ask people on your team like, hey, you're neurodivergent. Can you do a whole session on what it's like to be a neurodivergent employee? But you can listen to kind of how they would like to be sharing their experience if they want to, and what ideas they also have. So they'll be able to maybe give you some different concepts. This is a little bit of a slippery slope because we don't ever want to put it on a person to educate us about how to be more mindful of our own limitations, our own biases. And so that's have to be done delicately. But I do think overwhelmingly, your staff is an enormous resource, and a lot of us are not tapping in and asking questions, even questions just like, do you have a suggestion for a program or a training topic, or what's a difficult situation that you've had on the deck or at the waterfront that you didn't know how to handle and it felt really sensitive and sticky and icky, and we can talk through it. So I think that would be a free resource, or one that you're already paying for, is kind of how I open this up. You don't have to do this work alone. Like, even just asking your team that question tells them about your intent, right? Of what you're trying to do, and you're going to get information back. Some of it might be hard to receive at first, but there's no better time to ask for that feedback than now, especially because once you start to ask, hopefully you're starting to do other actions and other steps that will make the future feedback more palatable.
Kate, don't laugh, but talking about asking your staff, I'm a Survivor fan. We all know this, but I vividly remember when Jeff Probst, maybe the first season post-COVID, he always used to say, "Come in, guys." And he specifically asked the contestants that year, is that okay? Is that still okay in 2021? And they all said, yeah. But then came back the next day and somebody said, "Hey, Jeff, I want you to know that that doesn't feel inclusive to me." And I think even things as simple as that, getting that feedback then sets the stage. Now your team knows that they can come talk to you about those things. And so that seems really simple, but I don't think I ever made that connection to doing that with your staff too.
Yeah, and I like the idea of collective, having that collective conversation, and I like the idea of giving people an out as well, to like tell you in ways that they don't have to as much be like and kind of constantly put themselves out there, because for some people that's against their nature, but then for other people, for the one person in that Survivor example, which isn't, I didn't see that season, but in that example, if it was the one person who felt regularly misgendered, it's gonna be a lot harder for them to raise their hand. And that's part of what allyship is, right? Is thinking through, this isn't me, but if this was someone I know, or if it was me, this would be something I want to think about, which is trying to use our, as much as possible, inclusive language and trying to make everyone feel welcome. And I think this is where people start to get, you know, we can't say anything anymore now, and everyone's so sensitive, and it's just a word. And people kind of get, really up in arms, I think, about taking away ways that they might be expressing themselves. And I think to flip that, instead of thinking about, what we can't say, it's thinking about what can we say that is that will reach as many people as possible, instead of just potentially saying one thing that makes someone feel a certain way. And it's such a small lift to just be mindful of how we say things. It's not really about, vilifying gendered language, or saying, trying to get people caught up so that they say the wrong thing. And then we can be like, that's not very woke of you, or whatever the case is. It's really about just trying to audit ourselves and say, if this makes anybody feel even a little bit uncomfortable, that doesn't feel like the best use of my energy then, because that would, as a person in the world, we all have the responsibility to try to be as aware of each other's needs as possible. So yeah, it's hard. Language is hard. Language around DEI topics is always changing, and that can be really challenging, because it feels like there's just so many things to remember, and no matter what you do, you won't get it right. But I do think a lot of it is the intention behind it, and just asking the question too. And then, like we talked about, that allyship as well. It's really low hanging fruit to try to use language that doesn't alienate people, essentially. And if that's the one thing we can do, is try not to alienate people by the language that we use, that feels doable. At least to me, it does. So
Well, Kate, we can't have a conversation with you without talking about the fact that you were featured in the Aquatics International 2026 Power Issue for embedding equity into aquatic operations. What did that recognition mean to you?
yes, this was a really fun recognition to get. When I started having conversations about equity in aquatics, it was coming from the lens of being an operator because I was at that time and feeling like I saw other folks doing work, very important work in aquatics in relationship to swim lessons and accessibility. But I felt like there was this disconnect between how do we really apply that though for aquatics professionals? So the award, obviously I was among really amazing company, and I think that we all have kind of different ideas of what recognition can look like for our work, but I feel like the best thing about that, obviously being validated of the work is really exciting. But even more than that, it really just highlights and kind of gives more of the opportunity for us to be making this conversation more widely accessible, which right now in 2026, there's growing demand for us to talk less about this stuff. So that's really affirmative and exciting. And it's encouraging too. I balance a lot of different roles in the industry, and I regularly wonder, have I unintentionally maybe diluted my thought leadership because it's so focused on DEIJ and it's such a niche topic inside of an already niched field. And I worry that I maybe am not able to get the concepts and the education out as widely as I would like. But this is just affirmation that we're kind of pushing these concepts still, and there's still space for that in 2026. And it's only going to continue to be an important topic to be teaching about and consulting about and sharing about, and so that's been really, really exciting.
Yeah. Without needing to get too much in depth with the article itself, what would you say is the main message you want people to take from your approach?
Yeah, I think all of what I'm trying to get to people is that there's practical ways to move towards inclusion that can or cannot involve a lot of resources and a lot of energy and effort. But I think fundamentally, one of the things that I'm really focused on right now is just this idea of trying to do the right thing and, try to make sure that other people recognize their space for them in whatever it is that you're offering. Really focusing on that belonging piece and that culture building piece, I think is key.
So, Kate, did that recognition and the exposure that the work you're doing in DEIJ, the exposure that it gave you, change the way you think about your role or the impact that you have on the people that you interact with?
Yes, I think I'm still kind of working through the different process of this, but one of the things I've wanted to do for a long time is to breathe more life back into the speaking component of Equitable Aquatics and also the consulting piece of Equitable Aquatics. And I think in a lot of ways, just like everybody, I've had stories in my own brain about the limitations maybe that I have with my own identities, but then also as someone who's doing this in addition to a full-time job and some other volunteer capacity and being a parent and a partner and all these other things. So it's a good reminder for me to keep doing that work. And I will say too, it always surprises people. I'm very outgoing and very talkative, and I do say kind of what's on my mind, but I also have immense imposter syndrome around these things. And I also have tons of hangover after I say something that's maybe a little bit charged or really strongly kind of stated. And I think that people tend to think, someone who's outspoken in this way must really not care what others think about them or must not really have some of that self-awareness. But I do actually have a lot of sometimes of my own like feelings to work through around this work. And so this has been really helpful for me just to remember that I have a voice and it's important to share it, but it's also helpful and essential to really elevate other people's voices as well and make sure that that's continuously a part of what my work is. But then also stepping into the power behind that, which I think all of us tend to think that everyone just kind of owns that and has that. And I just want to be a reminder that that's not always the case. Like I get anxiety before I speak. I replay conversations in my brain like everybody, like most people. I second guess myself. I say the wrong thing and I worry about it for weeks afterwards, misspeak about these topics. I say the wrong word choice, all of those things. And so I think it's also a reminder to me that all the stuff we've talked about today has been the human focus of these things. And just like we need to be thinking about human first and kind of people first, we also need to remember that all of us are doing the best that we can in each of these settings too.
Of course. And what do you hope more people in aquatics will understand about the connection between equity and operational excellence?
I think that the big thing is that this work benefits everyone. I think a lot of times we already talked about this with language is that we're taking away, and I just want to reiterate that accessibility, being more mindful of inclusion, having more diverse voices, this benefits everyone regardless of what their identity is. It's not diversity work has always been additive. It's never been about taking things away from people. It's always been making sure that everyone has access to resources and opportunities and all of the things, even in the social settings that we think of, like access to education, access to life-saving swim instruction, access to gainful employment, all of these things. So I think that's the big thing. Accessibility really does benefit everyone, and that's just something that we need to continue to reframe, because I think we're getting a lot of messaging that that's not the case. So I think that we need to continue to make sure that that is the truth that we're working towards, and it looks different for every person and for every facility, but ultimately inclusion and accessibility does benefit everybody.
Kate, you've also had the chance to experience the AUAP conference from a few different perspectives: power speaker, attendee, exhibitor, vendor, and board member. How has that changed the way you think about the community building?
Yes, I've been really lucky to see AOAP from all of these different sides. So as someone who, went the first time and then saw people speaking and was like, I want to do that, to being a vendor, a board member, like you mentioned. I think the big thing is that shared networking and the people piece. So making sure that you're having conversations and that you're building relationships, whatever this looks like, I think is really important. But I definitely think that there's no community building that's too small. So in the past, I think I measured success in a few different ways based on like what role I was stepping into. But I think that there's, again, just like everybody has their own kind of unique perspective of where they can be activated and where they can be involved in part of conversations around furthering inclusion and justice. I think there's little ways to build community that are small, relationship building, conversation building, showing up, all the way up to kind of some of these more like active ways. And I think it takes all of that. So even if the capacity you have to build community feels really small when you're participating in AOAP programming or the conference, over time that might change and you might have more capacity to be able to be more involved. But I definitely think it's really driven from the relationships that you establish and that you continue to kind of water and foster as you go, and being able to share that experience with other commonality, like all of us, regardless of what kind of industry we work in, as far as like a nonprofit versus municipal, we all kind of have this shared understanding about aquatics. And I think that's such a key part also to inclusion, right? We all want to feel like we belong. And so when we're together at AOAP, we all are belonging together and to each other because of this aquatic piece. So it's really just then letting that make space for the other things that might be different from person to person, but still helps us build community.
You were the DEIJ rep for conference education, helping select sessions, and then you were conference co-chair. Now you're conference education chair. Beyond community building, what are you noticing before that you didn't notice when you were seeing conference from the outside as an attendee or a vendor?
I think the biggest thing as I've been more and more involved in the layers is just how much, obviously there's a lot of logistical stuff that goes into all of these different layers. So you can't take the work out of it without, mentioning that that's such a huge part of it. But I think the other piece is the intention. So there's so much intention that goes into all of this stuff. And I think that's one of the things that it's important for us to weight the intention with the impact, just like we do in DEIJ stuff, is everything's coming together and we're thinking about the different layers of education sessions and room layouts and trying to get diversity of speakers. And those are just some of the things that I touch, but there's obviously hundreds of different decisions that are made. And the intention is really there to try to make sure that there's something for everybody and it's meeting the needs and it's meeting people where they're at, which is really difficult to do at scale. But it's definitely something that is intentional from volunteers and from staff to try to be aware of that and to receive feedback, learn from feedback. I think that sometimes we just kind of make up our mind about something like, oh, this must like they did it this way because of this reason. But I will say that the amount of feedback that comes back that is, floated by the board and floated by committee chairs and then through staff is really an enormous amount that we're looking at it and thinking about it and trying to think outside the box and try to improve from it. And I think that's really special because I think there are many, 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 many boards where people just kind of sit on it and it's business as usual. And they say in recreation, like the worst phrase is, we've always done it that way and not trying to evolve and grow. And so I think that's the piece that's very obvious for me now that I'm more into the layers. I think in the past, I assumed that was happening just because I think people in aquatics are very passionate. So everyone likes to kind of just work and improve and things like that. But I can say now that there's so much intention behind decisions that are made and what's being done. And that's really cool to see.
And you touched on this a little bit, but how can the conference be used as a tool for inclusion, not just education?
Yeah, so I think the way that we approach trying to make sure that there's intentional networking, and I think this is always something that we're thinking about is you make these relationships, you want to catch up with everybody maybe once a year when you get to see them. And so that sometimes prioritizes bringing in new people into the fold or being able to have conversations with people that maybe are new to the industry and stuff. But I think that everyone is super mindful about trying to prioritize those opportunities for networking and those opportunities for mentorship. But I also think finding ways to bring in first time attendees is key. And then finding ways, obviously, to make sure that the people that come is diversifying. And then the education that we offer is also as diverse as possible. I also think there's been a lot of steps as far as feedback and just best practices when it comes to speakers to make sure that they're thinking more critically about how to reach people. So making sure slides are succinct and people can read them and making sure that they don't have to ask, can everybody hear me? But they're just automatically using a microphone in a room that maybe the acoustics is really tough. Making sure that they're being appropriate and the language that they use and just some of those best practices around education, I think has also been really important and something that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of emphasis in trying to make sure that those standards are lifted because not everybody that speaks at conference is a seasoned speaker or a professional speaker. It might be part of the DEI component as we want to give rising leaders an opportunity to have the floor and have those conversations, but then we also want to protect the environment as much as possible with education sessions within the context of the conference and have some of those best practice perimeters.
AOAP and the aquatics industry as a whole lost a huge personality just not too long ago in Craig Murphy, who was a longtime board member, and a lot of people in the industry knew him well. The board knew him well. But what struck me as we were all remembering Craig was the number of people who said Craig was the first one who made me feel welcome and made me want to get involved with AOAP. When you look at conference, what are some of the things that you think about that make someone feel truly welcomed at a professional gathering like AOAP?
Yes, when I think of Craig, I think of kind of those main tenets of someone that's approachable, someone that's inviting you into conversations, starting conversations with you. Not everyone feels super comfortable coming out themselves. I mean, we've all been around someone who just walks up to a table when they don't know anybody and it's like, hi, but that's not everybody's comfort level. So having some of that I think is really important. And then feeling seen and included, right? So finding ways to just ask the question of can we bring other people in? Can we ask other people if they want to participate? Can we take actual interest in other people in a time when all of us are just so busy and so distracted and, um, so digital, really? It's like going back to that analog way of just having connection in person goes a long way. And just all of us like to feel important and be able to talk about ourselves and things that interest us as well. So taking interest in others so that they can have that reflection of themselves, I think um, is really key. And just friendliness. I think that being mindful that you might be genuinely connecting with someone that you've known for a very, very long time, but you also want to try to find ways to bring other people in, especially if they've been identified as a first year attendee or if they're a young or new professional. Just finding those different ways to try to get people involved and like ask the question who, if you're interested in more information, let me know. We're going up to people and finding some ways like that. That's at least what makes me feel welcomed and definitely made me feel welcome at conference. And I too had some really positive, kind, friendly, approachable conversations with Craig. And I think if that can be on everyone's list of just trying to add that among all the other things that we're trying to do in this human experience to just try to make other people feel welcome, I think we'll all be better for it and we'll make more of those touch points and more of those connections.
In working with AOAP and as you continue to work with them, what ideas or conversations are you most excited to bring forward?
I think that as the industry continues to evolve, I think one of the things I have been noticing is that there seems like there is more and more turnover and just people coming into the field for a second, third year. So finding some ways to get those folks involved relatively quickly to kind of catch them and keep them hostage a little bit in the industry and then get some of their feedback and some of their ideas, just like we would be getting that information from staff on our team, kind of looking at it through that same lens, I think is really important. I also think we're navigating a time where politics has infiltrated itself into DEIJ. And so just finding ways to make sure that people feel like they can still do what's right and not be necessarily penalized or feel like their own self is in danger, either professionally or personally, by trying to do some of these things that just essentially are trying to reach everyone where they're at and get everyone involved is important. A lot of folks that are part of AOAP membership are working in a position that they might have some metrics or some instruction on being mindful at their local level, their state level, their county, about what they're doing and how they're coming across because a lot of this stuff has been polarized. So I think that is definitely a new frontier that we're kind of building the response to in real time. And then I would say the last piece is as AOAP continues to grow, which it is, it has been steadily growing as membership has grown and as our community and industry impact has grown, the staff of AOAP has grown. How do we stay kind of at the forefront of thinking about these topics as the Association of Aquatic Professionals for Aquatic Professionals, and just be really mindful too that some of it's getting back to basics, some of it's being revolutionary, and depending on where someone's at, they're going to get value from somewhere along that spectrum and just staying really motivated by that and making sure that we're continuing to put out some good content, some good conversation starters, good resources, and being a place that people know that they can come back to get some of those answers to the sensitive or the sticky situations as well. And that advice that they're going to get is not going to be just generic advice or advice that's not super tailored to their needs, but it's going to be also for aquatic professionals by aquatic professionals. And so hopefully it lands even better and it's more actionable and more practical for folks.
All right. We're going to do a little lightning round time. Okay.
Oh,
Quick questions, quick answers.
okay.
All right. What's one small change an aquatic facility can make right away to be more inclusive?
Walk through the deck, look at all the signage that you have, and make more inclusive signage if it's not using photos and pictures, and if it's not as concise as possible, and if it's not in other languages aside from English.
Love it. What is one thing that every committee should ask itself more often?
Who does not have a seat at this table, or who is this conversation benefiting, and who is it not benefiting?
What does good leadership look like to you?
Listening more than you're talking, and then constantly making sure that your intent is matching up with how it's coming across. So asking that question, making sure as you say it out loud, it's coming back and it's what you're intending for it to come across. So much can be solved leadership wise with curious conversation and better communication. And that's a two-way street, listening and speaking.
Be curious, not judgmental, as the great Ted Lasso says. Kate, what's a misconception people still have about DEIJ work?
One of my favorite things is teaching other people that are passionate about DEIJ that we're really doing this work for like what's called the movable middle. So there's like the 80% in the middle that don't really have strong opinions either way. There's the 10% that have a very strong opinion that this is their life's work. And then there's the 10% at the other end of the spectrum that, um, for whatever reason, have, very strong opinions that are really problematic and harmful. But the rest of us are, in that 80%. And we're all a lot more unsure about this stuff than we are sure. So I think that's exciting and interesting. And that's who I do my work towards is the movable middle, that 80% in the middle. And I think that's important to remember because things happen in a echo chamber where we're all just hearing the same thing over and over again. And that's not the majority. The majority isn't sharing their thoughts on Facebook about these topics. They're off living their lives.
And last question, what gives you the most optimism about the future of aquatics?
I think young people really inspire me. I think that there is more and more intention behind everything that young people are doing. I really am inspired by the rising generation that many of us are supervising. And I definitely think that there's a lot of personal attachment to these topics, and they're going to continue to have high expectations of their workplaces, of their bosses, of what they're being a part of. And I think that is going to require a lot of response on the end of people in other generations to meet them at that level, and I think that's really exciting.
That's awesome. Kate, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your perspective, for all the work that you're doing to make aquatics stronger and more welcoming and more intentional. Your approach to DEIJ, which I think we could all say is very practical and thoughtful, and mostly it's grounded in community and people, is a great example of the kind of leadership that this profession needs.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and for the conversation.
Of course. We'll include links to Kate's Aquatic International feature, AOAP resources, and any relevant conference information in the show notes. We hope this episode gives you ideas you can actually put into practice in your own facility, company, or organization. To learn more about the Association of Aquatic Professionals, our training conference, visit aquaticpros.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the AOAP's discussion from the deep end, made for aquatic professionals by aquatic professionals.